Imagine this. You show up to your son's birthday in a neat outfit, heart full of anticipation, only to have your daughter-in-law tell you not to let anyone know you're his father. Just because their neighbors and business associates look down on people who aren't from their social class. The sting of that moment, the blatant dismissal, is something you don't easily forget. If you were me, would you feel offended? Before we dive into the story, drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. The dining hall gleamed with cold perfection. Polished granite floors, an impossibly long glass table, and silver flatware that still bore the department store tags. I'd driven up that morning after Eveline's last-minute reminder text. "You're still coming. Alistair will expect you there." The implication, as always, was that my presence was optional, but absence would be noted. Still, I came. I brought a bottle of Helena's 1978 Bordeaux, something she'd once said we'd save for Alistair's milestone moment. I'd wrapped it in fine linen and tucked a handwritten note inside the label. I wasn't expecting a grand gesture, just acknowledgement. I pulled into the paved driveway of Alistair's sprawling home in Lake Oswego, Oregon. The neighborhood hummed with an affluent, self-satisfied quiet. Eveline met me at the door, her smile a little too bright, a little too fixed. She leaned in, her voice a low, urgent whisper that didn't quite match the pleasantries she was mouthing. "Hello, Maxwell. Please don't tell the neighbors you're Alistair's father. Just say you're an old friend from Bend." Her eyes darted towards a couple watering their lawn next door. "You don't understand how people here judge. Your pickup truck, your old clothes. They look at all of that and they make assumptions." Alistair appeared behind her, impeccably dressed. Alistair, my only son, had always possessed a certain kind of magnetism. Driven, sharp, and with an uncanny knack for making money. He was the kind of man everyone admired from a distance and expected great things from. He offered a polite, though distant nod. "Yes, Dad. You know, there are many people from the upper echelons here tonight, and we simply want to protect our image. I hope you'll be cooperative and conduct yourself appropriately." The words hung in the air, a cool, precise cut. My own clothes, a perfectly good tweed jacket and pressed trousers, felt suddenly itchy. I forced a polite smile and followed them inside. The sounds of laughter and chatter muffled at the front door swelled as we stepped into the grand foyer. Clearly, the party was already in full swing. Eveline, radiant in a crimson gown, was already drifting through the crowd, laughing a little too loudly. Alistair, sharp and attentive, worked the room, his hand always ready for a shake, his smile for a quick, confident exchange. I found myself by the window observing. A few minutes later, an older gentleman, a neighbor, approached me, a friendly curiosity in his eyes. "Lovely home, isn't it? I'm Tom Henderson, their neighbor. Haven't seen you around here before." "How do you know the Hawthorns?" he asked. Before I could answer, Eveline, seemingly materializing from nowhere, smoothly glided between us. Her arm linked with the neighbor's, her voice sweet, almost sugary. "Oh, Mr. Henderson, you've met Maxwell, haven't you? He's an old family friend of ours from back in Bend." She squeezed the neighbor's arm playfully, her eyes sending a clear, cold message to me. Alistair joined them, a confident smile on his face. "Indeed," he chimed in. "A very old family friend from Bend." Eveline then steered the neighbor away, her back a deliberate shield between us. Alistair offered me a fleeting, almost imperceptible smirk before following her. Throughout the evening, every interaction felt calculated. Eveline consistently turned her attention to others when I was near, engaged in animated conversations with her husband's business partners, never once making eye contact with me if I tried to catch her gaze. Alistair was equally adept, always just out of reach for a genuine conversation, always steering any shared glances back to his wife or another guest. They were a united front of polite dismissal, Later, Eveline wore a crimson gown and diamonds. She gave her toast with the confidence of someone certain every camera in the room was pointed her way. She praised Alistair's new business acquisition, his leadership, his discipline. Then, with a flick of her manicured wrist, she gestured for him to speak. Alistair stood, holding a glass of champagne. "Not the Bordeaux I brought," he said, and smiled as his gaze swept the table. "Well," he chuckled, "I'm grateful for all of you being here. This past year, my ventures have truly soared, thanks to my own relentless focus and the incredible team I've built." I didn't blink. I placed my fork gently beside the untouched steak, folded my napkin, stood up. No dramatic exits, no choked sobs, just me sliding the chair back, smoothing my suit jacket and saying with quiet dignity, "Thank you for dinner." Then I turned and walked toward the door. No one followed. No one called my name. Back at the guest suite, I zipped my suitcase without folding anything. The Bordeaux sat unopened on the counter. The only sound was the wheeled suitcase bumping down each wooden stair as I carried it outside. I drove the familiar route back to my own home, the silence in the car heavy. The sound of the Pacific greeted me before I even stepped inside. My house had always felt warm despite its age, but that evening the walls seemed to retreat from me. Maybe they were waiting to see if I'd brought grief home again. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I hung my coat, turned the heat up a notch, and poured a cup of lukewarm tea I'd left in the pot 2 days before. Then I went into the master bedroom, sat at the edge of the bed Helena and I once shared, and slipped off my loafers with a quiet sigh. I reached beneath the bed and pressed my palm flat against the teak floorboard near the center. A soft shift. The wood lifted just enough for my fingers to slip under. Beneath it, nestled in the same space that once hid anniversary gifts and emergency cash, was the tan folder. I hadn't touched it in years, not since Helena and I first drafted the plans when Alistair got engaged. The label still read, "Contingency, Personal." I placed it on the bed and opened it slowly, each page as familiar to me as my own handwriting. The first sheet, deed to my house in my name alone. The next, the living trust for Alistair's home. Funds transferred through my firm years ago, but the controlling interest had never been released to him. I'd always meant to hand it over when I turned 75, but 71 is old enough. I reread the clause about revocation rights, my initials beside Helena's signature, the lawyer's stamp. Everything Alistair thought was his wasn't. I closed the folder and ran my hand over the worn manila cover, not with vengeance, but with a quiet steadiness. I didn't need to rage. I didn't need to explain. I just needed to act. I slid the folder into my briefcase along with my checkbook and the old mahogany ledger Helena had always kept tucked in her desk drawer. It began shortly after Alistair and Eveline got engaged. Alistair had an idea, a promising app, something to do with scheduling logistics for restaurants. I didn't understand the tech, but I understood the passion in his voice. He needed help with development costs, and of course I said yes. The second startup came 2 years later. That one didn't even make it to launch. I covered the office lease, bought the website domain, and paid off a silent partner who threatened legal action when things unraveled. I also offered to help with the down payment on their home. A head start, I called it, though I quietly paid in full and let them think it was partial. Alistair was proud of the home they had secured, and I didn't want to take that feeling of achievement from him. I just wanted them to feel secure. Eveline was always polite, never warm. After the wedding, she sent a typed thank you card, unsigned. When Alistair opened his investment firm, he called it Pembroke Capital, and within 2 weeks, he and Eveline came to me panicked about unexpected expenses. I wrote a check without asking for details, hoping to alleviate their stress. They never said, "We need you." They said things like, "It'd just be easier," or "We'll make it up to you." Or we were hoping you might step in just this once. But it was never just once. The calls grew shorter, edged in impatience. Alistair no longer asked about my hobbies or sent photos of their vacations unless there was a request for funds attached. Eveline's voice was always cool, clipped, like my presence in their life was a formality they tolerated. It wasn't the money, I whispered aloud now, fingers tracing the edge of the ledger. It was the expectation I'd always say yes. And I had, for too long. I flipped open the maroon book and turned to the most recent page, a list of transactions, each marked personal transfer. 32 of them spanning 9 years. Not one had been repaid. I picked up my pen and drew a single line under the last entry. The first act of saying no didn't need to be loud, just final. The office smelled like eucalyptus and laminate. My attorney, Oliver Stratton, was younger than my coffee maker, but he was sharp and discreet. I handed him the folder without preamble. I'd like to finalize the trust amendments, effective immediately, I told him, and I want to transfer ownership of my primary residence to the holding company, Hawthorne Property Management. He blinked once but said nothing, just nodded and began scanning the documents. I'd pre-filled most of the forms. Old habits. Oliver paused over one page. "You're removing Alistair as contingent beneficiary?" Oliver questioned, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," I stated simply, meeting his gaze. He paused. "To no one?" "For now," I affirmed, letting the finality hang in the air. It took under an hour. He didn't ask questions after that. I appreciated that. Before leaving, I handed him a sealed envelope labeled, "To be opened only upon my death." From there, it was just mechanics. I called the realtor I used to play golf with, told him to quietly list the house but only sell to Lachlan Holdings. The sale would loop back to a trust under my name. It was a transaction that looked like surrender on paper. It wasn't. After meeting with Oliver, I began packing what I needed from my home. A few clothes, Helena's locket, the ledger, the tan folder, and one photo of her and me on Cannon Beach back before Alistair was born. I left behind the oak dining table where we used to play cards. I left the wedding photo on the mantel. I left my good golf clubs, my vintage watches, and the blanket Helena's mother sewed when we were newlyweds. And I left one envelope taped to the back of the pantry door. It wasn't labeled. The next morning, I signed a year-long lease on a furnished condo in Newport, Oregon under the name Maxwell Thorne. The keys felt cool in my palm. Next, I visited the regional bank. I froze 2 accounts and redirected others to new holdings. The card Eveline used for her boutique expenses would stop working by morning. The final step, a text to Alistair. Short, no blame. "You made your wishes clear. I'm simply obliging." No forwarding address, no emotion. Eveline was standing at the register of her high-end boutique when her corporate card was declined twice. She laughed politely, blamed the machine, and tapped it again. Declined. She tried her phone app. Access denied. By the time she got home, she was flushed and fuming. "You need to call the bank," she snapped at Alistair, tossing the card on the marble counter like it had betrayed her. He shrugged, half listening. But when he opened the mortgage portal and saw the payment had bounced and then found himself locked out of their joint account, his face drained of color. He tried calling the regional bank. Wait times, then more questions than answers. That evening, Alistair found the envelope. It was in the mailbox, wedged between a real estate flyer and an overdue HOA notice. No return address, just Alistair's name, handwritten in looping cursive that had once signed his school permission slips. He opened it at the dining table, lips pressed tight. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper. No greeting, no sign-off, just one sentence. "You asked me to disappear. I simply obeyed." Eveline scoffed. "He's being dramatic." Alistair didn't answer. He read the line again and again. He held the paper like it might change under his fingers. "He's bluffing," Evelyn said, standing. "He'll be back, or begging for forgiveness. You'll see." But Alistair didn't believe that because he knew the house, the accounts, the foundation of his company. All of it was held together by silent threads Maxwell had woven through the years. Gently, invisibly, without ever asking for control. And now those threads had been cut. He opened his laptop, clicked into his business dashboard. Red warnings blinked where green numbers used to be. The expansion loan he'd signed last month, secured against family assets, was now a loose promise. He reached for his phone, thought about calling him, thought about apologizing, but he didn't even have his number anymore. Up the coast, I sipped tea as waves rolled against the shore and opened the ledger to a fresh page. The rain had come in waves that morning, soft and rhythmic against the window panes. I sat at the small table near the glass, ledger open, reading by natural light. The mahogany cover had faded along the spine, but inside every page was intact, neat, dated, precise. I turned to the last section Helena had ever written in. It was from the final month of her life when she could barely hold a pen, but still insisted on tracking every detail. Her handwriting trembled, yet the words were steady. "If our son ever forgets kindness, Maxwell will remember law." She had written it just after Alistair had canceled a visit. Said he was too busy to fly up for his mother's birthday. Helena didn't say a word aloud, but she wrote that sentence and underlined it twice. I ran my fingers over the ink, feeling the quiet weight of it settle in my chest. For years I believed kindness would be enough. That love, even when stretched thin, could still hold its shape. But kindness without boundaries becomes currency. And eventually people forget it ever had value. I placed a fresh sheet in the printer tray, began making copies of every financial transfer, every loan I forgave, every promise Alistair or Eveline made in writing and never kept. Their signatures showed up far more than mine. Once the packet was assembled, I sealed the first copy in a thick envelope marked Hawthorne Private. That one would go into my safety deposit box. The second stack I fed into the scanner, one page at a time. There was a journalist I remembered from years ago. I'd helped her fight a legal loophole that was cheating single fathers out of subsidized housing. She'd sent a thank you note that read, "If you ever need a story told, I'll be listening." I found her email, Fiona Whitcomb. She still wrote under the same byline. I drafted a message, brief and measured. "I think I have a story for you. One about trust, silence, and where the money really came from," I wrote to her. I attached the files, clicked send, and turned back to Helena's handwriting. The headline dropped on a Tuesday. FinTech CEO's hidden ties to untraceable family funds. It wasn't a smear job. It was precision work. Fiona had done her homework, pulled dates, cross-referenced financial transfers, even quoted one of Alistair's early investors who'd assumed the funds came from venture capital, not a parent's retirement. There were no direct accusations of fraud, just the kind of sharp, clean exposure that raised every eyebrow in a boardroom and shook every hand that once signed a check in his favor. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I simply closed the article, folded my hands, and sat in stillness. By Wednesday, Alistair's company website went offline for maintenance. By Thursday, 3 investors had issued public statements distancing themselves from the brand. By Friday, Eveline packed a single suitcase and left a single note for Alistair. "I married a man who needed a father, not a wife." The irony wasn't lost on me. That weekend, Alistair drove to my old house. I know this because the neighbor I once lent my power tools to emailed me confused. Said a man in a designer suit had knocked twice, looked through the windows, and sat on the porch steps for nearly an hour. He'd aged in the photo he sent. Less polish, more panic. The house, of course, was empty. The deed no longer read Maxwell Hawthorne. It now belonged to Lachlan Enterprises. The lights were off. The garden was overgrown. He tried the mailbox, but there was nothing there. The neighbor said he didn't say a word when he left. Just drove off slowly, one hand at his mouth, the other tight on the wheel. I stood by my window that evening, watching the tide roll in. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed. Closure wasn't something he could demand. Some things, once untethered, drift far beyond reach. I brewed a fresh pot of tea and sat with the quiet. The wind rattled the windows, but inside everything held. The knock came to his office door early in the morning. Two men in plain suits, soft-spoken but firm. They handed Alistair a sealed notice and requested access to his financials. The IRS doesn't arrive with sirens, they arrive with files. At first, he played it off. Delays, miscommunications, maybe an outdated EIN. But when they mentioned multiple flagged accounts tied to a non-disclosed family trust, I imagine his mouth went dry. The trust was never in his name. He'd signed documents over the years, of course, but never read them fully. I always left him the illusion of control, and he never questioned what didn't resist. That illusion had expired. I received the update indirectly from my attorney, Oliver. The firm had been contacted for clarification, which we had already anticipated. Everything was in order, legal, binding, airtight, and quiet. That afternoon, my attorney mailed Alistair a letter, certified, signed. It read, "Dear Mr. Pembroke, per the original trust agreement executed under Hawthorne Holdings, please refer to Clause 18B. In the event of emotional misconduct or breach of dignity toward the trustee, assets may be reallocated at the sole discretion of said trustee. The reallocation has been completed. No appeal will be granted." He read it 3 times, then called straight to voicemail. He tried again, then opened his laptop, typing out an email. Something between apology and plea, I never saw it. All he received was a short reply from the server. "This inbox is no longer active." That night I opened my own inbox to a confirmation. The remaining assets had successfully been redirected. My name removed from Alistair's holdings. The final accounts rolled into a charitable trust under Helena's name. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt like sealing a door. Outside, the tide had risen again, foam licking at the stones. I sat in the quiet, lit a single candle, and pulled the donation ledger close. The scholarship details were almost ready. The papers arrived in a thin manila envelope, neatly tabbed and ready for signature. The fund would bear Helena's full name, Helena May Hawthorne Memorial Scholarship. It would support students studying financial stewardship with a clause requiring a focus on elder guardianship and ethical estate planning. A small amount at first, enough for 1 student a year, but permanent, protected. My name wouldn't be listed as founder, just an anonymous donor. It was better that way. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted a shift in the current, subtle but certain, toward care, not convenience. I signed the last page, sealed the envelope, and walked it to the corner post box myself. No courier, no announcement. On the way back, I passed the little gallery near the wharf. A new piece hung in the window, a soft charcoal etching of a man standing alone on a cliffside, the wind tugging his coat toward the sea. His face was turned away, but his posture was familiar. Steady, not bowed, not broken, just still. I stopped in front of it and stood there for a long while. Tourists passed behind me, their chatter muffled by glass and distance. I didn't move. Helena would have liked the piece. She always said, "Good art tells the truth without trying to be loud." "Some stories end in silence," I murmured, "not forgiveness." I didn't need a portrait on anyone's mantle. I didn't need my name carved into plaques or mentioned in speeches. I had something else now. Peace. I turned from the gallery window, pulled my scarf tighter, and continued home along the path that edged the dunes. The wind had picked up, salt hanging in the air, the kind that reminded you everything eventually returns to the sea. Back at the condo, the candle had burned low. A halo of wax puddled around the base. I blew it out gently, tucked the leftover documents into a drawer, and opened the envelope that had arrived earlier. White, no return address. The handwriting inside was shaky, but I recognized it immediately. A year to the day, Alistair stood before a weathered headstone nestled in a small private cemetery outside Portland. The engraving is simple: Hawthorne, beloved by none, known by few. He lived 72 years and left it all to education. He read it twice. He hadn't known what to expect, but something inside him, some childish thread of hope, had convinced him he'd find his name etched in stone. Maybe even a quote, a date, a chance at closure. Instead, just a name he once used in filings, a shell company, an alias. Not a father, no flowers, no photo. No sign that anyone ever came here but him. Later that afternoon, he sat in a corner booth of a small cafe in downtown Ashland, far from cameras, far from headlines. A single almond tart rested on the porcelain plate in front of him. He didn't touch it. The pastry was his favorite to bake. Light, not too sweet, with just the right density in the crust. He hadn't eaten one in years. It used to annoy him the way I insisted on baking from scratch when store-bought was quicker. Now the smell alone made his chest ache. His phone buzzed. A missed call from the bank. A message from Eveline. Just a question mark. He turned the screen face down. The coffee beside him had gone cold. He was alone now, not publicly. There were still people around him, but truly, quietly, irrevocably. And somewhere far from him, I walked the coastal trail that curved along the dunes of Newport, Oregon. The wind was brisk, but the sun warm on my cheek. I bent down and picked up a small pink shell, perfect and whole. I held it to my ear, not to hear the ocean, but to remember how silence can be both echo and answer. I didn't need to visit any graves. I was still very much alive. He wanted me gone. So I gave him exactly that, and everything that came with it. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.